Captain Sarah Ghost Martinez adjusted her helmet one last time as she climbed into the cockpit of her AH-64 Apache helicopter. The morning sun cast long shadows across the forward operating base in Afghanistan, and the familiar weight of her flight gear felt reassuring against her shoulders. She had flown this route dozens of times before, but today something felt different in the air. Her co-pilot and gunner, Lieutenant Jake Bulldog Thompson, settled into the front seat below her. They had been flying together for 8 months now, long enough to communicate with just a glance or a subtle shift in body language. Jake was fresh out of flight school when he first arrived, all nervous energy and textbook knowledge. Sarah had taken him under her wing, teaching him the unwritten rules of combat aviation that no manual could ever capture. Pre-flight check complete, Ghost, Jake's voice crackled through the intercom. His Texas drawl had become as familiar to Sarah as her own heartbeat. All systems green and ready for takeoff. Sarah ran through her own mental checklist, her hands moving over the controls with practiced precision. The Apache was more than just a machine to her, it was an extension of her will, a deadly dance partner that had never let her down in 3 tours of duty. The twin turboshaft engines hummed to life, their vibrations traveling through the airframe and into her bones. Tower, this is Apache 77, requesting clearance for Patrol Route Bravo, Sarah spoke into her radio, her voice calm and professional despite the knot of unease in her stomach. Apache 77, you are cleared for departure. Weather is clear, visibility unlimited. Be advised, intelligence reports possible insurgent activity in grid squares 47 and 48. Sarah acknowledged the transmission and lifted the helicopter into the crystal-clear Afghan sky. Below them, the rugged landscape stretched endlessly in all directions, a maze of valleys, ridges, and hidden caves that had swallowed armies throughout history. The mountains stood like silent sentinels, their peaks dusted with snow even in the summer heat. As they flew their patrol pattern, Sarah's mind wandered to the letter she had received from her younger sister Maya the day before. Maya was getting married next month, and Sarah had promised to be there. It would be the first wedding in their family since their parents had died in a car accident 5 years ago. Maya was nervous about walking down the aisle without their father to give her away, and Sarah had assured her that everything would be perfect. Hey Ghost, check out 2 o'clock, Jake's voice brought her back to the present. Looks like some kind of gathering down there. Sarah banked the Apache to get a better view. Through her optics, she could see a group of men moving between several compounds in a valley below. Their movements seemed coordinated, purposeful. She had learned to trust her instincts over the years, and right now those instincts were screaming that something was wrong. I see them, Bulldog. Looks like maybe 15 to 20 military-aged males. No visible weapons, but they're moving with intent. Sarah zoomed in with her targeting system, studying the faces through the high-resolution camera. They keep looking up at the sky. That's not normal behavior for farmers or herders. Jake was already on the radio, reporting their observations to the Tactical Operations Center back at base. Intelligence had been tracking increased insurgent activity in this region for weeks, but concrete evidence had been elusive. The enemy had learned to adapt, to blend into the civilian population until the moment they chose to strike. As they continued their patrol, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The hair on the back of her neck stood up, a primitive warning system that had served her well in combat. She had learned early in her career to never ignore that feeling. It had saved her life more than once. The radio crackled to life with an urgent transmission from their base. Apache 77, we have reports of a convoy under attack approximately 10 kilometers north of your current position. You are directed to provide immediate close air support. Sarah's training kicked in instantly. She banked the Apache hard to the north, the G-forces pressing her deep into her seat. Jake was already bringing the weapon systems online, his fingers dancing across the controls with deadly efficiency. The Hellfire missiles hung beneath their aircraft like sleeping predators, waiting to be awakened. Convoy under attack, this is Apache 77 responding to your call for assistance, Sarah transmitted on the emergency frequency. What is your situation? The response came through heavy static and the sound of automatic weapons fire. Apache 77, this is Convoy Charlie 2. We are taking heavy fire from multiple positions. We have wounded and are pinned down in the open. Request immediate fire support on targets of opportunity. Sarah could hear the desperation in the ground commander's voice. Somewhere below, American soldiers were fighting for their lives, depending on her and Jake to even the odds. It was the kind of responsibility that never got easier, no matter how many times she had shouldered it before. The convoy came into view as they crested a ridgeline. Sarah could see the Humvees arranged in a defensive circle, their occupants firing at muzzle flashes coming from multiple positions in the rocky terrain around them. Smoke was rising from one of the vehicles, and she could see figures moving between the trucks, some carrying stretchers. "I've got eyes on the convoy," Sarah reported. Multiple insurgent positions firing from elevated positions to the east and west. "Bulldog, can you get a lock on those muzzle flashes?" Jake was already tracking targets through his sight system. "Roger that, Ghost. I'm seeing at least 6 firing positions. Recommend we take out the eastern group first, they have the best angle on the convoy." Sarah maneuvered the Apache into an attack position, using the terrain to mask their approach. The insurgents were so focused on the convoy that they hadn't noticed the helicopter's arrival. It was a tactical advantage that Sarah intended to use to its fullest extent. "Convoy Charlie 2, this is Apache 7-7. We are beginning our attack run. Mark your positions with smoke and keep your heads down." Purple smoke began rising from the convoy's position, clearly marking the friendly forces for the helicopter crew. Sarah lined up her first target, a group of insurgents firing from behind a low stone wall. Her finger hovered over the trigger, waiting for the perfect moment to engage. The Apache shuddered as Jake fired the first Hellfire missile. Sarah watched through her optics as the precision weapon streaked toward its target, leaving a thin trail of smoke in the clear mountain air. The explosion sent rock and debris flying in all directions, silencing the enemy position permanently. "Good hit, Bulldog. Shifting to target 2. Sarah banked the helicopter to line up their next shot, her movements smooth and controlled despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. This was what she had trained for, what she lived for. In these moments of combat, everything else faded away except the mission and her responsibility to the soldiers on the ground. As they engaged the remaining targets, Sarah felt the familiar surge of satisfaction that came with a successful mission. Each enemy position they eliminated meant fewer bullets flying at the convoy below. It meant American soldiers would go home to their families instead of coming back in flag-draped coffins. But, even as they systematically destroyed the insurgent positions, that nagging feeling of unease continued to gnaw at her. Something about this whole situation felt orchestrated, too convenient. The enemy had learned to use American tactics against them before, and Sarah couldn't help but wonder if they were walking into something larger than it appeared. The convoy was beginning to move again, the immediate threat neutralized by the Apache's intervention. Sarah began to relax slightly as they provided overwatch for the vehicle's withdrawal from the danger area. Maybe her paranoia was getting the better of her after all these months of combat. That was when Jake spotted the reflection from the hilltop to their south. "Ghost, I'm getting a glint from that ridgeline, about 4,000 meters south-southeast. Could be nothing, but..." His voice trailed off as he adjusted his optics for a better look. Sarah felt her blood run cold as she turned to look in the direction Jake was indicating. She had seen that particular type of reflection before, usually just before surface-to-air missiles started flying in their direction. The insurgents had been getting more sophisticated in their tactics lately, and shoulder-fired anti-aircraft missiles were becoming increasingly common in their arsenal. "Bulldog, talk to me. What are you seeing over there?" Jake's voice was tense when he responded. "Multiple heat signatures moving into position. Looks like they might have been waiting for us to commit to helping the convoy." The pieces of the puzzle suddenly fell into place in Sarah's mind. The convoy attack had been a trap, designed to lure the Apache into a predetermined kill zone where the insurgents could engage it with surface-to-air missiles. The men they had observed earlier in the valley had probably been spotters, reporting the helicopter's position and movement patterns. "We need to get out of here now," Sarah said, already beginning evasive maneuvers. But, even as she spoke, she knew it might be too late. The insurgents had planned this carefully, and they had chosen their moment well. The first missile launch was visible as a streak of white smoke rising from the ridgeline, followed quickly by a second and, then, a third. The insurgents weren't taking any chances, they wanted to ensure that their trap would be successful. Sarah threw the Apache into a violent diving turn, using every trick she had learned in her years of combat flying. The helicopter's countermeasure system deployed automatically, filling the air around them with chaff and flares designed to confuse the incoming missile's guidance systems. Missile launch, missile launch." Jake's voice was calm despite the mortal danger they faced. "I count 3 inbound, possibly more. Deploying countermeasures. Sarah pulled the Apache through a series of aggressive maneuvers, pushing the aircraft to its limits as she tried to break the missile's lock on their heat signature. The G-forces were tremendous, pressing her vision to the edges of blackout, but she maintained control through sheer force of will and years of training. The first missile streaked past them, its proximity fuse failing to detonate as it was confused by the defensive flares. The second missile followed a similar path, overshooting the helicopter as Sarah's evasive maneuvers threw off its tracking algorithm. But the third missile was different. Newer, more sophisticated, with a guidance system that could distinguish between the helicopter's actual heat signature and the decoys being deployed around it. Sarah watched in horrified fascination as it adjusted its course, homing in on them with mechanical precision. "Jake, this one's got our number," she said into the intercom, her voice surprisingly calm given their circumstances. "I want you to know, it's been an honor flying with you." In that moment, as death approached at supersonic speed, Sarah's mind filled with images of home. She thought about Maya's wedding, about the promise she had made to walk her sister down the aisle. She thought about her parents, and how they would have been proud of the choices she had made in her life. She thought about all the soldiers whose lives she had saved over the years, and how their families would never know her name but would forever be in her debt. Most of all, she thought about Jake, the young pilot who had become like a little brother to her. He had a wife back home, a baby daughter he had never met. His whole life was ahead of him, full of possibilities and dreams that might be cut short by her decisions and her career choices. As the missile closed the final distance between them, Sarah made a choice that defined everything she had ever stood for as a pilot and as a human being. Instead of continuing her evasive maneuvers, she rolled the Apache to present the smallest possible target profile for Jake's position, using her own body and section of the aircraft to shield him from the worst of the coming explosion. "Tell my sister I love her," she whispered into the intercom, and then she began to laugh. It wasn't hysteria or fear that brought the laughter bubbling up from deep inside her chest. It was something else entirely, something that spoke to the absolute certainty that she had lived her life exactly as she had chosen to live it. She had made a difference, she had saved lives, and she had stood between the darkness and the light when it mattered most. The laughter continued as the missile's warhead detonated against the Apache's armored skin, and Sarah's voice was the last thing transmitted over the radio frequency before the aircraft disappeared in a ball of flame and smoke that could be seen for miles across the Afghan countryside. Lieutenant Jake Thompson felt the world explode around him in a symphony of twisted metal and searing heat. The Apache helicopter disintegrated beneath him as the missile's warhead tore through the aircraft's armored hull, sending fragments of rotor blades and engine components spinning through the mountain air like deadly confetti. His last clear memory was Sarah's laughter crackling through his headset, a sound so unexpected and strangely peaceful that it seemed to slow time itself. The crash happened in stages, each second stretching into infinity as Jake's training fought against the chaos consuming his aircraft. The initial explosion had severed the tail rotor assembly, sending the helicopter into an uncontrolled spin that pressed him deep into his seat. Through his cracked visor, he watched the Afghan landscape rotate in a nauseating kaleidoscope of brown earth and blue sky. Sarah's section of the cockpit had taken the direct hit. Through the smoke and flames, Jake could see her slumped forward in her harness, her helmet cracked and her flight suit darkened with blood. She wasn't moving, wasn't responding to his desperate calls over the intercom. The woman who had taught him everything about combat flying, who had become his mentor and surrogate big sister, was dying just a few feet above him. The Apache struck the mountainside with tremendous force, the impact driving Jake's consciousness into a black void where time had no meaning. When awareness finally returned, he found himself hanging upside down in his harness, blood dripping from his forehead onto the shattered instrument panel below. The acrid smell of burning aviation fuel filled his nostrils, mixed with the metallic taste of his own blood. Emergency training took over where conscious thought failed him. Jake's hands moved automatically to release his harness, dropping him heavily onto what had once been the cockpit ceiling. Every movement sent waves of agony through his left shoulder and ribs, but he forced himself to ignore the pain. The helicopter was on fire, and he had maybe minutes before the fuel tanks exploded and turned their crash site into a crematorium. "Sarah! Ghost, can you hear me?" Jake called out as he struggled toward the rear cockpit. The twisted metal and debris made progress agonizingly slow, each inch forward requiring tremendous effort. His vision kept swimming in and out of focus, and he could feel warm blood running down his face from a gash in his scalp. When he finally reached Sarah's position, Jake's heart nearly stopped. The missile had detonated just behind her seat, and the blast had driven pieces of the aircraft's armor plating into the cockpit like massive shrapnel. Sarah was unconscious, her breathing shallow and labored. Blood soaked the front of her flight suit, and her left leg was pinned beneath a section of twisted rotor blade. Jake tried to lift the metal debris trapping Sarah's leg, but his injured shoulder screamed in protest and refused to provide the necessary strength. The fuel fire was spreading, and he could hear the ominous groaning of stressed metal as the helicopter's frame continued to settle into its final resting position against the rocky mountainside. "Come on, Ghost, stay with me," Jake pleaded as he worked to free his pilot from the wreckage. "You promised Maya you'd walk her down the aisle, remember? You can't break that promise now." Sarah's eyes fluttered open, unfocused but alive. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper, each word clearly causing her tremendous pain. "Jake, you need to get out of here. The fuel tanks. I'm not leaving without you." Jake's voice carried a determination that surprised even him. 6 months ago, he had been terrified of his first combat deployment. Now, faced with losing the person who had made him into a real pilot, he discovered reserves of courage he never knew he possessed. Using a piece of debris as a lever, Jake managed to shift the metal pinning Sarah's leg just enough to drag her free from her seat. She cried out in agony as her broken bones shifted, but Jake knew that staying in the burning helicopter meant certain death for both of them. He had to get her clear of the wreckage before the fuel tanks detonated. Half carrying, half dragging Sarah, Jake fought his way through the shattered cockpit toward what remained of the helicopter's side door. Every few steps, he had to stop and rest, his injured body threatening to give out completely. Sarah drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes helping with their escape and sometimes dead weight in his arms. They were perhaps 20 feet from the helicopter when the fuel tanks finally exploded. The blast wave knocked both pilots flat against the rocky ground, showering them with burning debris and superheated air that singed their exposed skin. Jake threw his body over Sarah's, shielding her from the worst of the explosion as pieces of their aircraft rained down around them like fiery meteorites. When the immediate danger passed, Jake found himself lying in a landscape that looked like the surface of an alien planet. The explosion had blackened the surrounding rocks and started several small brush fires in the sparse vegetation clinging to the mountainside. Their helicopter was nothing more than a burning skeleton of twisted metal, sending a thick column of black smoke into the clear Afghan sky. Sarah was unconscious again, her face pale and waxy with shock and blood loss. Jake checked her pulse and found it weak but steady. Her leg was clearly broken, probably in multiple places, and she had sustained serious injuries to her torso from the missile blast. Without immediate medical attention, she would die on this remote mountainside. Jake activated his emergency beacon and tried to raise their base on his survival radio, but the mountains interfered with the signal. He was able to transmit a brief mayday call, but wasn't sure if anyone had received it clearly enough to determine their location. The smoke from their burning helicopter would be visible for miles, but it would also serve as a beacon for any insurgents in the area. As if summoned by his thoughts, Jake heard the distant sound of voices echoing off the canyon walls below their crash site. He grabbed his sidearm and crawled to a position where he could observe the valley through the rocks. A group of armed men was moving up the slope toward them, their weapons clearly visible and their intent unmistakable. The insurgents who had shot them down were coming to finish the job. Jake looked back at Sarah, who was breathing irregularly and showed no signs of regaining consciousness soon. He was injured, alone, and facing at least a dozen enemy fighters who knew the terrain far better than he did. His ammunition was limited to the magazines for his pistol and whatever he might be able to salvage from the wreckage. But Jake had learned something important during his months of flying with Sarah Martinez. He had learned that being outnumbered and outgunned didn't mean being defeated. He had watched her face impossible odds with nothing but skill, determination, and an absolute refusal to give up. Now it was his turn to prove that he had absorbed those lessons. Moving carefully to avoid making noise, Jake positioned himself among the rocks above their crash site where he could observe the approaching insurgents. He counted 12 men, all carrying AK-47 rifles and moving with the confidence of fighters on their home territory. They were spread out in a loose skirmish line, clearly expecting to find wounded or dead American pilots who wouldn't pose much of a threat. That was their first mistake. Jake waited until the insurgents were within 50 meters of the crash site before opening fire. His first shot dropped the lead fighter, and his second and third shots sent the others scrambling for cover among the rocks. The element of surprise gave him a momentary advantage, but Jake knew it wouldn't last long. These men were experienced fighters who would quickly adapt to the situation. The firefight that followed was unlike anything Jake had experienced during his training. This wasn't a simulation or a training exercise where mistakes could be corrected and lessons learned. Every decision he made, every shot he fired, would determine whether he and Sarah lived or died on this desolate mountainside. The insurgents began working their way up the slope, using the rocky terrain for cover as they advanced. Jake moved between different firing positions, never staying in one spot long enough for the enemy to get an accurate fix on his location. He had to make every shot count, since ammunition was limited and resupply was impossible. When his pistol finally ran empty, Jake retreated back toward the crash site to check on Sarah and look for additional weapons or ammunition. She was still unconscious but breathing, and Jake could see that his makeshift bandages were helping to slow the bleeding from her most serious wounds. Among the helicopter's scattered debris, Jake found Sarah's rifle and several magazines of ammunition that had somehow survived the crash and explosion. The weapon was damaged but functional, giving him significantly more firepower than his sidearm had provided. He also located a first aid kit and used its contents to better stabilize Sarah's condition. The insurgents had used the lull in fighting to completely surround the crash site. Jake could hear them moving through the rocks on all sides, their voices carrying on the thin mountain air as they coordinated their final assault. They knew the Americans were wounded and trapped, and they were taking their time to ensure that neither pilot would escape alive. Jake established a defensive position that allowed him to protect Sarah while maintaining fields of fire in multiple directions. He had perhaps 60 rounds of ammunition left, facing an enemy force that outnumbered him 12-1. Mathematics suggested that his situation was hopeless, but Jake had learned from Sarah that mathematics didn't account for determination and desperation. The first coordinated assault came just as the sun began to set behind the western peaks, casting long shadows across the crash site. The insurgents attacked from 3 directions simultaneously, their muzzle flashes strobing in the gathering darkness as they poured automatic weapons fire into Jake's position. Jake fought back with the methodical precision that Sarah had drilled into him during countless training flights. He picked his targets carefully, making every shot count while conserving ammunition for the battles still to come. When the insurgents pulled back to regroup, they left 3 more of their number lying motionless among the rocks. But Jake was down to his last magazine, and his shoulder wound was bleeding again from the exertion of combat. Sarah remained unconscious, her breathing becoming more labored as shock and blood loss took their toll. Even if Jake could somehow defeat the remaining insurgents, Sarah needed medical attention that he couldn't provide in their current location. That was when he heard the sound that changed everything, the distant thunder of helicopter rotors echoing off the canyon walls. Someone had received his distress call after all, and help was finally on the way. The insurgents heard it too, and Jake could sense their growing desperation as they realized their window of opportunity was closing rapidly. American forces were notoriously aggressive about recovering their own people, and any rescue attempt would bring overwhelming firepower to bear on the crash site. The final assault began before the rescue helicopters even came into view. The remaining insurgents threw everything they had at Jake's position, determined to eliminate the American pilots before help could arrive. Jake returned fire as rapidly as he could aim, his rifle barrel growing hot from sustained use as he fought to keep the enemy away from Sarah. When his ammunition finally ran out, Jake drew his sidearm and prepared to make his last stand with the few rounds he had remaining. But the insurgents had waited too long. The rescue formation appeared over the ridgeline like avenging angels, their weapons already tracking targets on the ground below. The Apache helicopters that arrived to extract Jake and Sarah were identical to the one that had been shot down, but they seemed to Jake like the most beautiful sight he had ever witnessed. Their door gunners opened fire immediately, driving the surviving insurgents away from the crash site and establishing a secure perimeter for the medical evacuation. As the rescue team loaded Sarah onto a stretcher and prepared her for transport, Jake finally allowed himself to believe that they might both survive after all. She was still unconscious, but the medics were working to stabilize her condition and get her to a field hospital where surgeons could address her most serious injuries. During the flight back to base, Jake held Sarah's hand and whispered updates about her sister's wedding plans, hoping that some part of her mind could hear him and find strength in the knowledge that she had people waiting for her to come home. The medics worked frantically to keep her stable, their faces grim but determined as they fought to save the life of a pilot who had become a legend among the aircrews in Afghanistan. Jake knew that Sarah's laughter just before the missile strike would haunt him for the rest of his life. Not because it represented her final moments, but because it captured everything she had tried to teach him about courage, sacrifice, and the absolute refusal to surrender in the face of impossible odds. In that moment of supreme danger, she had chosen to laugh rather than cry, to face death with defiance rather than despair. As their rescue helicopter carried them toward safety and medical care, Jake made a silent promise to himself and to Sarah. He would become the kind of pilot she had tried to make him, the kind of person who could laugh in the face of death and protect others even at the cost of his own life. He would carry forward everything she had taught him, ensuring that her sacrifice would continue to save lives long after her own recovery. The Landstuhl Regional Medical Center in Germany had seen thousands of wounded warriors pass through its doors during the long years of conflict in Afghanistan and Iraq. But the arrival of Captain Sarah Martinez created an unusual stir among the medical staff who specialized in treating the most critically injured soldiers. Her case file read like a catalog of trauma injuries that should have been fatal, yet she had somehow survived the missile strike and helicopter crash that claimed her aircraft. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, the head of the hospital's trauma surgery department, stood beside Sarah's bed in the intensive care unit and reviewed her patient's chart for the third time that morning. The list of injuries was staggering: multiple fractures in her left leg, 3 broken ribs, a punctured lung, severe lacerations across her torso, and a traumatic brain injury that had kept her unconscious for nearly 2 weeks since her arrival in Germany. Her co-pilot saved her life, Dr. Rodriguez told the small group of medical residents gathered for morning rounds. Lieutenant Thompson pulled her from burning wreckage and defended their position for hours until rescue arrived. The preliminary reports suggest he eliminated several enemy fighters while protecting her. Sarah's sister Maya had flown in from Colorado 3 days earlier, taking leave from her job as a high school teacher to maintain a constant vigil beside her sister's hospital bed. Maya looked exhausted, her eyes red from crying and lack of sleep, but she refused to leave the hospital except for brief trips to the cafeteria or bathroom. The doctors say her brain activity is normal, Maya told their Aunt Carmen during one of their daily phone calls. All the tests show that she should wake up, but something is keeping her unconscious. They think it might be psychological trauma from the crash. Lieutenant Jake Thompson sat in his own hospital room 2 floors below, his left arm immobilized in a complex sling system that held his shattered shoulder in proper alignment for healing. His physical injuries were serious but not life-threatening, and the doctors expected him to make a complete recovery within a few months. The psychological wounds were proving more difficult to treat. Jake hadn't spoken about the details of their shootdown and crash to anyone except the military investigators who needed his statement for their official report. He answered their questions with mechanical precision, providing facts and timelines without emotion or commentary. When they asked about Sarah's final transmission, the laughter that had preceded the missile strike, Jake simply said that she had maintained her courage until the very end. The rescue team had recommended both pilots for Valor Awards based on their actions during and after the crash. Sarah's decision to shield her co-pilot from the missile blast, and Jake's successful defense of their crash site against superior numbers, represented the kind of heroism that military leaders used as examples in training academies around the world. But Jake felt no pride in his actions, only a crushing sense of responsibility for Sarah's condition. He replayed every moment of their final flight in his mind, searching for signs he might have missed that could have prevented the ambush. The insurgents had planned their trap carefully, using the convoy attack as bait to lure the Apache into their kill zone. Intelligence reports later revealed that they had been tracking American helicopter patrol patterns for months, looking for the perfect opportunity to strike. On the 15th day after their arrival at Landstuhl, Jake was finally cleared for limited mobility within the hospital. His first destination was the intensive care unit where Sarah remained unconscious, surrounded by monitors that tracked every aspect of her vital signs. Maya was there as usual, reading aloud from a romance novel that Sarah had mentioned enjoying during one of their recent phone calls. "Jake." Maya stood up and embraced him carefully, mindful of his injured shoulder. "The doctors said you were recovering well. How are you feeling?" Jake studied Sarah's still form in the hospital bed, noting the countless tubes and wires that connected her to various machines. Her face was pale and thin, marked by fading bruises from the crash, but she looked peaceful rather than pained. The steady beeping of her heart monitor provided a reassuring rhythm that confirmed life continued within her injured body. "I keep thinking about something she said during our last conversation before the mission," Jake told Maya. "She mentioned your wedding, how excited she was to walk you down the aisle since your father couldn't be there." Maya's eyes filled with tears at the reminder of their family tragedy. Their parents had died in a winter car accident 5 years earlier, leaving the two sisters to navigate major life milestones without the guidance and support they had always taken for granted. Sarah had stepped into a parental role for Maya, providing advice, encouragement, and unconditional love during the most important moments of her younger sister's life. "I postponed the wedding," Maya said quietly.
I can't imagine getting married without Sarah there. Tom understands, and we decided to wait until she recovers. Jake nodded, understanding the decision completely.
He had learned during his months flying with Sarah that family loyalty was one of her defining characteristics. She carried photos of Maya in her flight helmet and talked about her sister constantly during their long hours of patrol duty. The idea that Maya would delay her wedding to wait for Sarah's recovery seemed like exactly the kind of gesture that would motivate Sarah to fight her way back to consciousness. Dr. Rodriguez appeared in the doorway, carrying a clipboard filled with test results and treatment notes. She had been treating combat casualties for 6 years, but Sarah's case presented unique challenges that tested all of her medical knowledge and experience. Her latest brain scans continue to show normal activity patterns, Dr. Rodriguez told Maya and Jake. There's no medical reason why she shouldn't regain consciousness. Sometimes in cases of severe trauma, the mind creates its own protection mechanisms that keep the patient in a safe state until they're psychologically ready to deal with reality.
Jake felt a sudden inspiration as the doctor's words registered in his mind.
If Sarah was unconsciously protecting herself from traumatic memories, perhaps familiar voices and reminders of positive experiences could help guide her back to wakefulness. He thought about all the conversations they had shared during flight missions, the jokes and stories that had helped pass time during long patrol hours.
Would it help if we talked to her about normal things? Jake asked. Shared memories, plans for the future, things that might remind her of reasons to wake up?
Dr. Rodriguez smiled, pleased that the young pilot was thinking constructively about his friend's recovery. Family members often underestimate the power of familiar voices and shared experiences. Many patients report hearing and understanding conversations that occurred while they were unconscious.
Maya squeezed Jake's hand gratefully. Would you help me?
I've been reading to her and talking about family memories, but she might respond better to someone who was with her during the crash.
Someone who understands what she went through.
Over the following days, Jake and Maya established a routine of spending time with Sarah, sharing stories and memories that painted a picture of a life worth returning to. Maya talked about childhood adventures, family holidays, and her plans for starting her own family with Tom. She described the wedding dress she had chosen and the honeymoon destination they were considering. Jake focused on their experiences as a flight crew, carefully avoiding the traumatic details of their shootdown while emphasizing the positive aspects of their partnership. He talked about the lives they had saved during convoy escorts and medical evacuations. He reminded her of the young soldiers who had returned home safely because of her skill and courage as a pilot.
Remember that convoy we escorted near Kandahar?
Jake said during one of his visits, his voice carrying the casual tone of someone sharing memories with a close friend. The lieutenant in charge was just 19 years old, scared out of his mind but trying to act tough for his soldiers. You spent the entire flight back to base telling me how much he reminded you of Maya's fiancé.
Maya looked up from her knitting with surprise. Sarah never told me she thought Tom looked like a soldier. Jake smiled at the memory.
She said he had that same earnest expression that young leaders get when they're trying to be responsible for other people's lives. She was really looking forward to meeting him at the wedding. As Jake continued sharing stories about Sarah's dedication to protecting others, Maya began to understand the full scope of her sister's military service. Sarah had always downplayed the dangerous aspects of her deployments, focusing instead on the technical challenges of flying helicopters and the camaraderie among her fellow pilots. She never told me about the combat missions, Maya said. In her letters and phone calls, she made it sound like she was mostly doing supply runs and transport flights. Jake nodded, understanding Sarah's desire to protect her sister from worrying about the daily dangers of combat aviation.
She didn't want you to spend every day wondering if she was safe.
But you should know that she saved dozens of lives during this deployment alone. Soldiers who are alive today because she was willing to fly into dangerous situations to help them. On the 18th day after the crash, something changed in Sarah's condition. Her brain activity increased noticeably, and she began showing subtle responses to external stimuli.
When Maya held her hand, Sarah's fingers would occasionally squeeze back.
When Jake spoke about their flying experiences, her heart rate would increase slightly as if she was trying to respond. Dr. Rodriguez cautiously optimistic about these developments, but warned against expecting immediate results.
Brain injury recovery can be unpredictable.
She might wake up gradually over several days, or she might have moments of consciousness followed by periods of confusion or disorientation.
The breakthrough came during one of Jake's afternoon visits.
He was telling Sarah about a letter he had received from his wife, describing their baby daughter's first attempts at crawling, when he noticed Sarah's eyes moving beneath her closed eyelids. Her breathing pattern changed, becoming more rapid and shallow as if she was struggling toward wakefulness. "Maya, call the doctor," Jake said urgently. "I think she's waking up." Sarah's eyes fluttered open slowly, unfocused and confused as her brain struggled to process the overwhelming sensory input of the hospital environment. She tried to speak, but her throat was raw from the ventilator tube that had been removed only days earlier. The sound that emerged was barely a whisper. "Jake?" Sarah's voice was hoarse and uncertain, as if she wasn't sure whether she was dreaming or awake. Did we crash?" Jake felt tears running down his face as he took Sarah's hand in his own. "We crashed, Ghost, but we made it out. You saved my life by shielding me from that missile. I've been waiting 3 weeks to thank you for that." Sarah's eyes moved around the hospital room, taking in the medical equipment and Maya's tear-streaked face hovering nearby. Memory was returning in fragments, pieces of their final mission mixing with dreams and unconscious fears that had dominated her mind during the coma. "Maya?" Sarah's voice was stronger now, filled with confusion and growing awareness. "What are you doing here? Shouldn't you be planning your wedding?" Maya laughed through her tears, overjoyed to hear her sister's voice again. "I postponed it until you could be there." Tom understood completely. "He's looking forward to meeting the sister who taught me everything about standing up for myself." Dr. Rodriguez arrived with a team of nurses and specialists, conducting rapid assessments of Sarah's neurological function and cognitive abilities. Her responses to questions were appropriate and her motor functions appeared normal despite the extended period of unconsciousness. The medical team was cautiously optimistic about her prospects for a complete recovery. As the medical personnel completed their examinations and updated Sarah's treatment plan, Jake remained beside her bed, still struggling to process the reality that they had both survived the missile attack that should have killed them. The woman who had taught him how to be a combat pilot, who had sacrificed her own safety to protect him during the crash, was going to recover and return home to her family. "I heard everything you and Maya were saying while I was unconscious," Sarah told Jake as the hospital room finally quieted down. "The stories about our flights, the conversations about the wedding, all of it. It gave me something to focus on when I was trying to find my way back." Jake squeezed her hand gently. "You were laughing when that missile hit us. I've been trying to understand how you could laugh at a moment like that." Sarah was quiet for a long time, gathering her thoughts as memories of their final moments in the helicopter became clearer in her mind. "I wasn't laughing at death, Jake. I was laughing because I realized that I had lived exactly the life I chose to live. I had no regrets about my decisions, no wishes that I had done things differently. In that moment, facing the end, I felt completely at peace with who I had become." Maya listened to this exchange with growing understanding of her sister's character and the choices that had led her to military service. Sarah hadn't chosen to become a combat pilot because she was reckless or seeking glory. She had chosen it because she believed in protecting others, in standing between danger and the people who couldn't protect themselves. "The doctors say you'll need months of physical therapy," Maya said. "Your leg was badly damaged in the crash, and you have some other injuries that need time to heal properly." Sarah nodded, already beginning to plan her recovery and return to active duty. "I'll be ready for your wedding, Maya. That's a promise I intend to keep no matter what it takes." Jake smiled at the determination in Sarah's voice, recognizing the same stubborn courage that had carried her through 3 combat deployments and ultimately saved both their lives during the missile attack. Recovery would be difficult and painful, but he had no doubt that Sarah Martinez would overcome every obstacle placed in her path. As evening settled over the medical center in Germany, Jake prepared to return to his own room for the night. His shoulder was aching from the day's activities, and the doctors had stressed the importance of rest during his own recovery process. But, before leaving, he had one more thing to tell Sarah about their final mission. "The convoy we were protecting when we got shot down," Jake said. "All of those soldiers made it home safely because of what we did. Their families will never know our names, but they get to keep their fathers and sons and brothers because you were willing to risk everything to protect them." Sarah closed her eyes, feeling the weight of that responsibility and the satisfaction of knowing that her sacrifice had served its intended purpose. Tomorrow would bring the challenges of recovery and rehabilitation, but tonight she was simply grateful to be alive and surrounded by people who loved her enough to wait for her return from the darkness. 6 months after the missile strike that nearly claimed her life, Captain Sarah Martinez stood in the dressing room of a small chapel in Colorado Springs, carefully adjusting the collar of her dress uniform. The morning sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows, casting rainbow patterns across the polished brass buttons and ribbons that marked her years of military service. Her left leg still ached from the extensive reconstructive surgery, but she was walking without assistance for the first time since the crash. Maya stood beside her sister, radiant in the wedding dress she had chosen before Sarah's deployment to Afghanistan. The ivory silk seemed to glow in the colored light from the windows, and the delicate lace details had been crafted by their grandmother decades earlier for their mother's wedding. It was a connection to their family's past that made this moment even more meaningful. "I can't believe this day is actually here," Maya said, her voice trembling slightly with emotion. "There were moments during your recovery when I thought we might never get to share this." Sarah turned away from the mirror to face her sister directly. The physical scars from her injuries were mostly hidden beneath her uniform, but the emotional impact of their near-death experience had changed both women in profound ways. Sarah had learned to value each day as a gift rather than taking her survival for granted. Maya had discovered reserves of strength she never knew she possessed while advocating for her sister's medical care. "I made you a promise," Sarah said simply. "I told you I would walk you down the aisle, and I keep my promises." The chapel was filled with family friends, fellow teachers from Maya's school, and a surprising number of military personnel who had traveled significant distances to attend the ceremony. Jake Thompson sat in the front row wearing his own dress uniform, his shoulder finally healed enough to allow normal movement. He had been promoted to captain following his actions during and after the helicopter crash, and he was scheduled to begin training as an instructor pilot when he returned to duty. Beside Jake sat his wife Jennifer and their infant daughter Emma, who had been born while he was still recovering in Germany. Jake had missed the first 3 months of his daughter's life, but the experience of nearly dying in Afghanistan had taught him to cherish every moment with his family. He planned to request assignment to a stateside unit when his current tour of duty ended. General Patricia Williams, the commanding general of the Aviation Brigade, had personally requested permission to attend the ceremony. Sarah's actions during the missile attack had become legend within the Army aviation community, studied in flight schools as an example of courage under fire. The general wanted to honor not just Sarah's heroism, but also the sacrifice made by all military families who sent their loved ones into harm's way. As the organ music began to play, Sarah offered her arm to Maya with the same steady confidence she had always brought to difficult situations. Her physical therapy had been grueling, requiring her to relearn basic movements that had once been automatic. But the determination that made her an exceptional pilot had also made her an exceptional patient, pushing through pain and frustration to regain her mobility. The chapel doors opened, and the sisters began their slow procession down the aisle toward the altar where Tom waited with barely contained emotion. He had grown close to Sarah during her recovery, visiting the hospital whenever his work schedule permitted and learning about the woman who had shaped Maya's character through years of protective guidance. Tom understood that he wasn't just marrying Maya, he was becoming part of a family that had survived extraordinary tragedy and emerged stronger for the experience. Sarah's near-death experience had reminded everyone of life's fragility, but it had also demonstrated the power of love and commitment to overcome seemingly impossible obstacles. As they reached the altar, Sarah placed Maya's hand in Tom's with a gesture that carried the weight of years of responsibility and protection. "Take care of her," Sarah whispered to her new brother-in-law. "She's the most important person in my life." Tom nodded solemnly, understanding the trust being placed in him. "I promise to love her and protect her for the rest of my life." During the ceremony, Sarah found her mind drifting back to the moments before the missile strike, when death had seemed inevitable and her thoughts had turned to this exact scene. She had accepted the possibility of missing Maya's wedding as the price of her chosen profession, but fate and medical skill had allowed her to fulfill her promise after all. The minister spoke about love, commitment, and the importance of family bonds that transcend individual circumstances. His words resonated deeply with the assembled guests, many of whom had experienced deployments, separations, and the constant uncertainty that accompanied military life. Marriage in their community required a special kind of courage, a willingness to build a life together despite the demands of service to country. When the ceremony concluded and the newlyweds kissed to seal their union, the applause that erupted from the congregation carried an emotional intensity that reflected their shared understanding of how precious and fragile happiness could be. Sarah felt tears running down her cheeks as she watched Maya and Tom begin their new life together, grateful beyond words that she had been spared to witness this moment. The reception was held at the Officers' Club on nearby Fort Carson, where Sarah had been stationed before her deployment to Afghanistan. The hall was decorated with white roses and soft lighting that created an atmosphere of celebration and hope. Military traditions mixed with civilian customs as the wedding party moved through the formal receiving line and the traditional first dance. During the reception dinner, Jake stood to offer a toast that he had been planning for months. His voice was steady but filled with emotion as he addressed the assembled guests and, particularly the bride and groom. "I've had the honor of flying with Captain Martinez through some of the most challenging situations any pilot could face," Jake began. "I've seen her make split-second decisions that saved lives, and I've watched her maintain her courage when faced with impossible odds. But, today, seeing her walk Maya down the aisle, I think this might be her finest moment." Jake paused to collect his thoughts, looking directly at Sarah as he continued. "Sarah taught me that real courage isn't the absence of fear. It's choosing to do what's right even when you're terrified. She chose to shield me from that missile blast, and she chose to fight her way back from unconsciousness so she could be here today. That's the kind of person Maya is lucky enough to have as a sister, and that's the example Tom is marrying into." The toast continued with Jake expressing his gratitude for Sarah's mentorship and friendship, but also his admiration for Maya's strength during her sister's recovery. "I watched Maya advocate for Sarah's medical care, coordinate with doctors, and maintain hope when the situation looked hopeless. She showed me that love isn't just about the good times, it's about standing by the people you care about when they need you most." As dinner concluded, the wedding party moved to the dance floor for the traditional festivities. Sarah's leg injury prevented her from dancing with her usual enthusiasm, but she managed a careful waltz with several of the military guests who wanted to pay their respects. Each conversation reminded her of the community she was part of, the brotherhood and sisterhood of arms that extended far beyond individual units or assignments. General Williams approached Sarah during a quiet moment between dances, requesting a private conversation away from the celebration. They walked onto a terrace overlooking the mountains that surrounded Fort Carson, where the evening air carried the scent of pine trees and the distant sound of military aircraft conducting night training exercises. "I wanted to speak with you about your future in the Army," General Williams said without preamble. "Your injuries from the crash have been carefully reviewed by the medical board, and they've determined that you can return to flight duty with certain limitations." Sarah had been waiting months for this conversation, uncertain whether her damaged leg would disqualify her from continuing her career as a pilot. The possibility of being grounded permanently had been almost as difficult to contemplate as the physical pain of her injuries. However, the general continued, "I have a different opportunity I'd like you to consider. We're establishing a new training program for combat aviation, and we need experienced pilots who can teach the next generation how to survive and succeed in hostile environments. Your actions during the missile attack have made you something of a legend, and young pilots need to hear your story from your own lips." Sarah considered this unexpected offer carefully. Teaching would mean staying stateside, being closer to Maya as she started her own family, and having the opportunity to influence countless young aviators who would face similar challenges in years to come. But it would also mean leaving behind the adrenaline and immediate satisfaction of combat flying. "Would I be able to continue flying at all?" Sarah asked. General Williams smiled. "The position would include regular flight duties for training purposes, plus the opportunity to develop new tactics and procedures based on your combat experience. You'd be flying, just not necessarily in combat zones." Sarah thought about Jake's transition from anxious rookie to confident combat pilot, and how much satisfaction she had found in watching his development. Teaching other young aviators to survive and protect others might be even more fulfilling than her own combat missions had been. "I'd like some time to consider the offer," Sarah said. "This has been a day for new beginnings, and I want to make sure I'm making the right choice for the right reasons." As they returned to the reception, Sarah noticed Maya and Tom sharing a quiet moment together, their faces glowing with happiness and anticipation for their future together. The sight reminded her of why she had chosen military service in the first place, to protect the freedom and security that allowed moments like these to exist. Later that evening, after the last guests had departed and the cleanup was complete, the extended family gathered in Maya's apartment for a more intimate celebration. Sarah sat on the couch with her leg elevated, still wearing her dress uniform but with her shoes kicked off and her collar loosened for comfort. Jake and Jennifer had stayed for the smaller gathering, and their baby Emma was sleeping peacefully in Jake's arms as the adults shared stories and memories from the day. The conversation naturally drifted to their experiences in Afghanistan and the crash that had nearly claimed both pilots' lives. "I still hear your laughter sometimes," Jake told Sarah. Not in a traumatic way, but as a reminder that there are worse things than dying. Living without courage, living without purpose, living without the people you love, those would be worse than dying.
Sarah nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. When I was unconscious in the hospital, I could hear you and Maya talking to me.
Your voices were like anchors that kept me from drifting too far away from life.
I followed them back to consciousness.
Maya took her sister's hand, marveling at the strength she could feel in Sarah's grip despite everything she had endured.
I was so angry at you for scaring me like that.
But I was also proud beyond words. You saved Jake's life, and he saved yours, and somehow you both made it home. As the evening wound down and the family members began to disperse to their respective homes, Sarah reflected on the unexpected paths that had led to this moment. 6 months ago, she had been lying unconscious in a German hospital while doctors worked to save her life. Tonight, she was surrounded by family and friends, having fulfilled her promise to Maya and contemplating new possibilities for her future service. The taxi ride back to her apartment gave Sarah time to process the day's events and begin thinking seriously about General Williams' offer. Teaching would be a different kind of service, but it would allow her to multiply her impact by sharing her knowledge and experience with hundreds of future pilots. She thought about the young men and women who would face the same challenges she had encountered, who would need to make split-second decisions under pressure while carrying the responsibility for other people's lives. If she could help them survive and succeed through better training and preparation, perhaps that would be an even greater contribution than her own combat missions had been. As Sarah prepared for bed that night, she looked at the photographs covering her dresser, images of Maya growing up, pictures from flight school, group photos from various deployments, and now a new picture from Maya's wedding showing the two sisters together in their respective uniforms. Each image represented a choice she had made, a path she had chosen to follow. Tomorrow would bring new decisions and new challenges, but tonight Sarah Martinez was simply grateful to be alive, to be home, and to be part of a family and community that had supported her through the darkest period of her life. The laughter that had marked her final moments in the helicopter had not been about facing death, but about celebrating a life lived with purpose and courage. Whatever the future might hold, Sarah knew she would face it with the same determination and protective instinct that had carried her through 3 combat deployments and ultimately brought her home to walk her sister down the aisle. Some promises were worth any sacrifice required to keep them, and Sarah Martinez had never learned how to break a promise.